Most people who study war focus on tactics, weapons, and leadership. But winter has killed more soldiers than bad generals ever did. And not because cold weather is mysterious, it's because armies and individuals consistently underestimate it. The common misconception is that winter defeats come from extreme temperatures alone. That is not what history shows. Armies rarely collapse because they didn't know it would be cold. They collapse because they failed to prepare logistics for cold. They neglected clothing systems. They miscalculated fuel consumption. They assumed mobility would remain unchanged. They believed morale would hold under cumulative discomfort. In other words, winter doesn't kill through surprise, it kills through small compounding mistakes. For those interested in preparedness, the overlooked lessons of winter warfare are not about heroics. They are about discipline, planning, and humility before environment. History offers a long record of what happens when those lessons are ignored. What defeats armies in winter is not temperature but logistics. Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia is often reduced to a story of snow and frostbite. But the Grande Armée began disintegrating before the worst cold set in. The true failure was logistical overstretch combined with unrealistic assumptions about supply. French planners, assumed they could forage effectively. They believed speed would compensate for distance. But they did not adequately prepare depots deep into Russian territory. When the Russians withdrew and scorched the countryside, food shortages began months before the worst winter conditions. By the time freezing temperatures arrived, the army was already malnourished and exhausted. Horses died first, which honestly crippled transport capacity. Once wagons were abandoned, artillery and supplies followed. Winter did not initiate collapse. It accelerated an already fragile system. Modern military doctrine absorbed this lesson. Cold weather planning now begins with caloric intake calculations, fuel redundancy, and mobility contingencies. Preparedness at an individual level follows the same principle. Cold magnifies prior weakness. If your supply chain, food, fuel, shelter is thin in mild weather, it becomes lethal in winter. Inadequate clothing systems are honestly a predictable and repeated mistake. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, planners expected the Soviet Union to collapse before winter, so winter clothing was not prioritized. The assumption was that strategic victory would render it unnecessary. As the campaign stalled outside Moscow, German forces faced temperatures they were neither equipped nor trained to endure. Lubricants froze, weapons malfunctioned, soldiers layered civilian garments under uniforms not designed for deep cold. Frostbite casualties mounted. The Red Army, by contrast, drew on institutional memory from previous winter conflicts. Soviet troops had quilted uniforms, felt boots, and a cultural familiarity with cold weather survival. The difference was not resilience alone. It was preparation embedded in doctrine. This distinction matters. Cold weather gear is not simply about insulation. It's about system design, moisture management, layering discipline, protection of extremities, and maintenance of equipment in freezing conditions. The Germans had high-quality equipment by European standards, but honestly, it simply was not configured for sustained sub-zero operations. The lesson for preparedness is, well, pretty straightforward. Possessing warm clothing is not enough. It must be appropriate for conditions, layered correctly, and integrated into a broader system that accounts for moisture, wind, and prolonged exposure. Fuel and mobility become strategic vulnerabilities in cold weather. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 illustrates another winter error, underestimating fuel demands and terrain limitations. German forces launched their offensive in the Ardennes under heavy cloud cover and snow, hoping to exploit Allied surprise. Yet the same winter conditions that grounded Allied aircraft also strained German supply lines. Vehicles consumed more fuel, idling just to prevent engine freeze. Roads became choke points and, breakdowns increased. Fuel shortages, which were already critical, became decisive. Cold thickens oil, reduces battery efficiency, and increases maintenance cycles. In civilian terms, this translates directly. Vehicles fail. More often, generators require more oversight, and stored fuel must be stabilized and protected. Mobility in winter just can't be assumed. It must be engineered. Preparedness-minded individuals often focus on stockpiling, but history suggests mobility and fuel sustainability are equally critical. Once movement becomes restricted, even small logistical gaps become survival threats. Shelter failures kill more reliably than combat. The Finnish-Soviet Winter War of 1939 to 1940 is frequently remembered for Finnish tactical brilliance. What receives less attention is the systematic Soviet failure in shelter discipline. Red Army units advancing into Finnish forests often bivouacked poorly, with inadequate insulation from snow and ground frost. Improvised shelters without proper ventilation led to heat loss and exhaustion. Meanwhile, Finnish forces operated from well-prepared positions, often using insulated dugouts and efficient stoves. The difference was not simply national toughness, it was an understanding that in deep winter, shelter is the primary defense. Exposure erodes combat effectiveness long before bullets do. So, a modern cold weather doctrine, really emphasizes rapid shelter construction insulation from ground conduction and, ventilation management to prevent condensation. These principles are just as relevant to a rural homestead today as they were to a 20th century battlefield. Improvised shelter, if you don't understand airflow and moisture, can actually become quite dangerous. Condensation, for instance, freezes, damp clothing loses its insulating value, and honestly, heat loss accelerates. In some historical cases, entire units became combat ineffective without ever even engaging the enemy. One of the least discussed aspects of winter warfare is really psychological degradation. During the Eastern Front campaigns, diaries from both German and Soviet soldiers describe not terror, but this relentless fatigue. Cold, disrupted sleep. Wet clothing never fully dried. Rations were insufficient, and boots stiffened overnight. No single event broke morale. Instead, cumulative discomfort eroded discipline. Frostbitten fingers reduced dexterity, making even simple tasks a challenge. Routine tasks required more effort, and small inefficiencies multiplied. For survivalists, this lesson is significant. Preparedness is not only material, it is procedural and mental. Winter demands routine maintenance. Drying gear, rotating socks, protecting batteries, clearing snow from ventilation openings. When fatigue sets in, these small tasks are neglected, and that neglect compounds. Historical after-action reports repeatedly note that units maintaining strict routines perform better, even under identical conditions. Discipline preserves energy, energy preserves clarity, clarity preserves survival. Perhaps the most dangerous winter mistake is assuming prior experience guarantees future survival. The German army in 1942 entered the Soviet winter with more awareness than the year before. Yet at Stalingrad, overconfidence in supply reliability and underestimation of encirclement risk proved fatal. Winter there did not surprise commanders. What failed was contingency planning. When the Sixth Army was surrounded, air resupply proved inadequate in freezing conditions. Aircraft availability dropped, runways iced over, fuel shortages intensified. The belief that we have endured winter before did not compensate for strategic miscalculation. Winter punishes rigidity. It rewards adaptability and redundancy. In preparedness terms, this means rehearsing failure scenarios. What happens if your primary heat source fails? If roads are impassable for weeks? If fuel deliveries stop? Experience without contingency planning becomes complacency. Modern doctrine reflects hard-earned lessons. Post-Second World War militaries institutionalized cold weather training. NATO forces developed specialized Arctic warfare schools. Clothing systems evolved into modular layering approaches. Vehicle lubricants were reformulated. Logistics planning incorporated cold weather multipliers. These developments were not theoretical. They were responses to documented failures. Cold weather doctrine now includes caloric increases of thousands of calories per day for active troops, strict rotation schedules, and equipment testing at extreme temperatures. The broader historical lesson here is that winter is not, some unpredictable enemy. It's actually a force multiplier against poor planning. Those who survive winter campaigns do so because, they respect its demands in advance. And for individuals concerned with resilience, honestly, the parallels are direct. Stockpiles must account for increased energy use. Heating systems require redundancy. Water access has to consider the risk of freezing. Communication devices, they really need cold-resistant power solutions. Each of these is, in fact, an extension of lessons learned at high cost. The 20th century produced industrialized warfare, yet winter, time and again, reduced modern armies to primitive struggles for warmth and sustenance. Technology did not eliminate vulnerability. It merely changed its form. Today, many assume infrastructure will compensate for environmental stress. But storms still disrupt supply chains. Power grids fail. Roads close. The same principles that governed armies apply to households, logistics, shelter, fuel, discipline. The historical record shows that winter does not forgive optimism. It exposes weak planning and, honestly, rewards redundancy. It punishes neglect of small maintenance tasks. It magnifies every oversight. Understanding these overlooked winter failures is not about romanticizing hardship. It's really about recognizing patterns. Again and again, across centuries, the same mistakes recur. Armies assume campaigns will conclude before cold arrives. Leaders underestimate fuel consumption. Soldiers neglect moisture management. Logistics planners fail to account for frozen transport routes. The result is, pretty predictable. Winter mistakes do not announce themselves dramatically. They accumulate quietly until recovery becomes impossible. That is the enduring lesson history offers. If you value careful, in-depth historical analysis that looks beyond battlefield maps and into the realities that shaped outcomes, consider subscribing to the Prepper Historian. And share this video with others who understand that preparedness is not paranoia, it is respect for the lessons written in history.